Sophia Carter stood on the rooftop of the building she used to own, the cold November rain soaking through her coat as the city spread out below her like a circuit board gone dark. 6 months. That was all it had taken to dismantle 12 years of her life. The company was gone, gutted by a cascade of lawsuits and defections she had not seen coming, or perhaps had refused to see. The investors had stopped returning her calls. The friends, the colleagues, the admirers who had once filled every room she walked into, they had vanished with the same quiet efficiency she had once used to restructure a workforce. In her hand was a single manila envelope. The final resignation letter from her last remaining board member and a certified notice from the bank informing her that by 9 o'clock the following morning, all remaining corporate assets would be seized and liquidated. She read the notice a second time in the rain, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something survivable. They did not. She walked back inside, took the elevator down to the floor that had once been hers, and sat down behind a desk that no longer belonged to her. She spread the bankruptcy filing across the glass surface. She uncapped a pen. And then, in the silence of the empty building, she heard footsteps in the hall. There was a time not so long ago, though it felt like a different century, when Sophia Carter's name could silence a boardroom. She had built her reputation the way a sculptor builds a monument, one deliberate, unforgiving stroke at a time. Carter Dynamics had gone from a seed-funded startup, operating out of a rented loft, to a publicly traded technology firm with offices in 4 cities, all within a decade. The financial press loved her. She appeared on the cover of 2 major business publications in a single calendar year. One headline called her the Steel Queen of Wall Street. Another said she was the executive that Silicon Valley was afraid of. She kept both framed in her office, not out of vanity, she told herself, but as reminders of what discipline and clarity of vision could produce. She wore her ambition like armor, and the armor fit perfectly. In meetings, she moved through the room with the focused economy of someone who had already calculated every variable. She spoke in conclusions, not in discussions. She decided, and the room adjusted. For a long time, that was enough. For a long time, it was everything. Carter Dynamics in those years was a company running at full velocity fast enough that no one stopped to ask whether it was running in the right direction. The numbers were good, the projections were better, the culture, though the culture was something else entirely, a thing that Sophia tracked on no spreadsheet and measured by no instrument, because she had decided early on that culture was a byproduct of success rather than a prerequisite for it. If you hired the right people and paid them competitively and gave them ambitious problems to solve, the culture would take care of itself. That was the theory. In the hallways of Carter Dynamics, in the break rooms and the open-plan floors and the glass-walled conference rooms, the theory was visible in the way all theories eventually become visible in the gap between what they promised and what they delivered. People worked hard. They always worked hard. But there was a particular quality that Sophia had noticed and filed away and chosen not to examine too closely. They worked hard the way people work hard when they are afraid of what happens if they stop. Not the way people work hard when they believe in something. She had noticed the difference once, years ago, in the first small office, when the company was new and the money was uncertain, and every person in the room was there because they had chosen to be rather than because the salary was competitive. She had noticed it, recognized it as something important, and then set it aside when the growth began, and the demands multiplied, and the thing she had called vision quietly became the thing she had to defend rather than the thing she was building toward. Sophia had never had much patience for conversations about culture. Culture, in her estimation, was the word that middle managers used when they wanted to avoid accountability. What mattered was performance. What mattered was the quarterly report. What mattered was whether the product shipped on time and whether the clients renewed their contracts. Everything else was noise. It was in this atmosphere, charged and pressurized as the inside of a reactor, that Daniel Reed existed, not loudly, not prominently, but steadily, in the way that a load-bearing wall exists inside a structure that has never been tested by wind. Daniel was a mid-level operations manager, the kind of person who arrived before anyone else and left after the last email had been answered. He had a daughter, 7 years old, whom he raised alone following the death of his wife 3 years earlier. He never mentioned this at work. It was simply a fact of his life. carried quietly the way he carried everything, with a particular stillness that some people mistook for passivity, and that others, if they paid attention, recognized as something closer to strength. He was not the loudest voice in any room. But when he spoke, what he said tended to be precise. And it tended to be right. He had worked at Carter Dynamics for 4 years when Sophia began the first round of aggressive restructuring. He had watched it unfold with the careful attention of someone who understood systems, who understood that when you pull one thread, the rest of the fabric shifts. And so, at a senior staff meeting in early October, Daniel Reed raised his hand and asked to speak. The proposal he laid out was detailed and, in retrospect, generous. A phased restructuring plan that would preserve the majority of the workforce while still achieving the cost reductions the board was demanding. He had run the numbers. He had consulted with 3 department heads. He had prepared a 12-page document outlining the implementation timeline and projected savings. He presented it calmly, standing at the front of the conference room while Sophia sat at the head of the table, with the particular expression she wore when she had already made up her mind. When he finished, the room was quiet. Someone coughed. Sophia set down her pen. She looked at Daniel, the way someone might look at a weather vane that was pointing in the wrong direction, not with anger, exactly, but with the mild irritation of someone whose certainty had been inconveniently interrupted. She said, in a voice that carried the full weight of her authority, "This company does not run on emotion, Mr. Reed. It runs on results. Thank you for your time." She moved on to the next agenda item. Daniel sat back down. He did not argue. He did not press the point. He simply looked at her, a long, level look that she would not remember until much later, in a moment when remembering was the most painful thing she could do. The firing happened 3 weeks later, in the same conference room, on a Tuesday morning in November when the rain came down hard against the floor-to-ceiling windows and the city outside looked gray and indistinct, like a photograph taken out of focus. Sophia had convened the senior team to announce the restructuring plan, her plan, the one that bore no resemblance to the 12-page document Daniel had submitted. The cuts were deeper than anyone had expected. 43 positions, eliminated immediately. 3 entire departments, consolidated or dissolved. The announcement was delivered in the measured, clinical language of a press release, because that was how Sophia operated. She presented facts, not apologies. She was not in the business of managing feelings. When the meeting ended and the other managers filed out in silence, Daniel remained in his seat. He waited until the last person had left before he spoke. He said that the people being let go had been with the company since its early years. He said that some of them had taken pay cuts during the lean quarters, had worked weekends without compensation, had turned down other offers because they believed in what the company was building. He said this not loudly, not with any particular heat, but with the steadiness of a man who understood that some things needed to be said regardless of whether they were welcome. Sophia listened from the head of the table, her expression unchanging. When he finished, she said, "A company that cannot pay its bills has no soul left to lose, Mr. Reed. That is the only reality I'm operating in." Daniel looked at her for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "A company that loses its people will lose its soul long before it loses its money. I hope one day you understand the difference." Sophia stood up. She straightened her jacket. She told him to collect his things and that security would escort him from the building within the hour. No severance, no letter of recommendation, no acknowledgement of the 4 years he had given to an institution that was, in that moment, failing in ways she had not yet begun to comprehend. He nodded once, as though she had confirmed something he had already known. He picked up his notepad and walked to the door. Before he stepped out into the hall, he paused and said, without turning around, "One day, you'll understand the value of loyalty. I hope it doesn't cost you everything to learn it." Sophia stood alone in the conference room for a long time after he left. Then she pulled out her phone and moved on to the next call. 3 years is both a long time and no time at all, depending on what fills it. For Carter Dynamics, those 3 years were a slow unraveling, the kind that begins invisibly, in the fraying of small commitments and the quiet departures of people who have stopped believing, and then accelerates, because once the foundation begins to shift, the walls follow. The first major client, a logistics firm that had been with Carter Dynamics for 6 years, terminated its contract in the spring of the second year. The stated reason was a service delivery failure, but the real reason, the one that lived in the subtext of every conversation leading up to the termination, was trust. The team that had managed that account had been gutted in the restructuring. The institutional knowledge, the relationships, the unwritten history of what that client needed, and when and how all of it had walked out the door with the 43 people Sophia had eliminated on a Tuesday in November. The loss of that contract triggered a clause in the company's primary funding agreement that allowed the lead investor to demand an early review. The review was not favorable. The investor withdrew a portion of its commitment. Other investors, watching, recalibrated their positions. By the third year, the board was in open conflict with Sophia's leadership. 2 members resigned publicly, citing irreconcilable differences in strategic vision language that the financial press translated, accurately, as a vote of no confidence. The company's valuation, which had peaked at an impressive figure 18 months earlier, had declined by more than 60%. Sophia fought for every inch of ground, the way she had always fought, with focus, with precision, with the unshakable conviction that if she worked hard enough and thought clearly enough, she could outmaneuver whatever was coming. She did not sleep. She did not eat regular meals. She moved through her days on espresso, and the kind of adrenaline that stops being a stimulant and starts being a symptom. The apartment, the penthouse she had purchased at the height of her company's success, 52 floors above the city, with its view of the harbor and its rooms full of carefully chosen objects, felt, in those months, more like a display case than a home. She would arrive home after midnight and stand in the kitchen and look at the city through the floor-to-ceiling glass and feel, for the first time in her adult life, something she did not have a precise word for. Not loneliness. Exactly, she had always been comfortable alone. Something closer to the awareness of an absence. The sense that something that should have been there was missing, and that she had not noticed its absence until the silence became too complete to ignore. The man she had been seeing for 2 years packed his things on a Sunday afternoon in March and said, gently, that he didn't think she was capable of letting anyone in. She didn't argue. She wasn't sure he was wrong. She poured a glass of wine after he left, and stood at the window, and looked at the city, and tried to feel something about it, and found, with a kind of clinical distance that frightened her slightly, that she mostly just felt tired. Not tired in the way that sleep fixes. Tired in a way that had accumulated over years, in the compounding interest of every conversation she hadn't had, and every person she hadn't seen, and every moment of genuine human contact she had rerouted through the machinery of professional usefulness. The night that broke her, the night that cleaved her life into a before and an after, was a quiet one, in the way that truly devastating nights often are. No dramatic confrontation, no final catastrophe, just a Tuesday evening in a high-rise office, long after the last of her remaining staff had gone home, with the cleaning crew moving through the floors below like ghosts and the city outside humming its indifferent hum. Sophia sat in her chair and did not move for a very long time. On her desk was a photograph framed, slightly dusty at the corner, from the day the company opened its first real office. She was in it, younger and sharper-eyed, standing in the middle of a room full of people who were laughing at something someone had just said. She did not remember what it was. She could not, looking at the photograph, remember the last time she had heard genuine laughter in a room she was in. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk and took out a bottle of bourbon she had been given as a gift years ago and never opened. She poured 2 fingers into a coffee mug. She held it without drinking. She thought, for the first time in years, about Daniel Reed. She did not know why. Perhaps because he was the last person who had said something true to her face, without flinching, without softening it into a shape she could more easily dismiss. Perhaps because she had spent 3 years trying not to think about it, which had, in its own way, become a form of thinking about nothing else. The bank's certified notice arrived by courier at 7:45 that evening. She read it at her desk, still holding the coffee mug. The language was formal and final. By 9 the next morning, the lien would be executed. The assets, the servers, the equipment, the leased office furniture, the branded vehicles, the small collection of original art she had hung in the reception area, because she had believed it conveyed the right impression, all of it would be seized. The bankruptcy filing was already drafted by her attorney. It sat in the manila envelope on the corner of her desk, next to the uncapped pen. She put down the mug. She reached for the envelope, She removed the documents and spread them across the desk. She picked up the pen. She looked at the signature line. She looked at it for a long time, the way you look at a door you know you are about to close forever. And then the lights in the hallway came on. She heard them before she saw him, the soft click of the overhead lights, activating in the corridor beyond the glass wall of her office, and then the quiet, measured sound of footsteps. Not hesitant, not rushed. The footsteps of someone who knew where he was going. Sophia set the pen down. She turned in her chair. And there, standing in the doorway of her office in the full fluorescent light of a Tuesday night, was Daniel Reed. He looked different, older, yes, but also more settled, more fully himself. As though the years since she had last seen him had not diminished him but rather clarified him. The way a sculpture looks more defined once the excess material has been removed. He wore a dark coat, still damp at the shoulders from the rain. He was carrying a leather portfolio. He was not smiling, but he was not hostile either. He was simply present, in the absolute way that very few people manage to be. Sophia stared at him. Her first impulse, the one that surfaced before thought could intervene, was shame, a hot, electric flash of it that she had not anticipated and could not conceal quickly enough. She covered it, the way she covered everything, with composure. She straightened in her chair. She said, in a voice that came out more level than she had expected, "Mr. Reed, you're the last person I expected to walk through that door." He looked around the office, the half-packed boxes, the bare walls where the art had already been removed, the stack of documents on the desk, and said, simply, "I know." He walked to the chair across from her desk and sat down without being invited, which she found, unexpectedly, that she did not mind. "You're here to watch," she said. It was not quite a question. He shook his head. "If I wanted to watch, I could have read about it in the morning." She looked at him. "Then, why?" He opened the leather portfolio on his lap and removed a single document, a check, she realized, as he leaned forward and placed it on the desk between them, a blank check, drawn on an account she did not recognize. The amount line was empty. The date was today's. Her name was in the payee field. She looked at the check for a long time. Then she looked at him. Daniel. His name in her mouth felt strange, too familiar, like a word she had forgotten the weight of. "I don't understand." He leaned back in the chair and looked at her with an expression that was not triumph, was not pity, was not anything she had prepared herself for. He said, "Fill in the number you need, whatever it takes to keep this company from going under tonight." The silence in the room was the loudest thing she had heard in months. She did not fill in the number. She could not move. Sophia Carter, who had once negotiated a $40 million acquisition across a 14-hour marathon session without breaking a sweat, sat behind her own desk and could not pick up the pen. "Why?" she finally said. "Why would you do this?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because, she understood, he was choosing the right one. "Do you remember," he said, "what this company was when you first started it? Not the valuation, not the press coverage." Before all of that, she didn't answer. She didn't need to. He went on. It was an idea that a lot of people believed in. People who showed up before there was anything to show up to. Who worked for salaries that weren't competitive because they thought they were building something worth building. He paused. "You had something real here, Sophia. You still do, maybe. But you let the machine eat the thing that made it run," she said, quietly. "You're talking about people. I'm talking about you," he said. "The person you were before you decided that the only way to protect what you'd built was to stop caring about anyone who helped you build it." The room was very still. Outside, the rain had slowed to a fine mist against the windows. Sophia did not speak for a long time. When she did, her voice came out differently than it had before, not smaller, exactly, but less defended, as though something had shifted in the architecture of her composure. She said, "I'm not the person I was then." He looked at her steadily. "I know," he said. "That's the problem. And that's also the only reason I'm here." He looked at the check on the desk. "I'm not saving your company, Sophia. I'm trying to save the person you were before you confused those two things." It was the first time she had cried in front of anyone in years. She did not sob, she was not built for that kind of grief. Or perhaps the grief was too deep for tears to reach all of it, but her eyes filled. And she did not look away, and she did not pretend it wasn't happening. She pressed her fingers against the edge of the desk and breathed through it. And Daniel sat across from her and did not say anything. Which was, she would think later, exactly the right thing. When she had steadied herself, she asked him what had happened to him after. He told her. After Carter Dynamics, he had spent 6 months unemployed, not for lack of offers, but because he had needed to figure out what he actually wanted to build, rather than what he was qualified to build. He had used his savings to start a small operations consulting firm. The first year had been very hard. He had almost shut it down in February of that second year, when a major client pulled out and he could not make payroll. His daughter, then 8 years old, had found him sitting at the kitchen table at midnight, staring at a spreadsheet, and had climbed into the chair next to him and put her head on his shoulder and said, without any particular drama, that everything would be okay because he was the smartest person she knew. He had closed the laptop and taken her back to bed, and in the morning he had called the client who had pulled out and proposed a restructured agreement that the client accepted. The firm had grown steadily after that. It was now doing well, quietly, without fanfare, the way Daniel preferred to operate. Sophia listened to all of this, with the particular attention of someone who has spent years not really listening, and is now, suddenly, hearing everything. When he finished, she said, "You could have walked away from all of it, including tonight." He nodded. "I could have, but you didn't." He looked at the check on the desk. "There are conditions," he said. "Not financial ones, not equity, not a board seat, not any of that." She waited. He said, "If you take that money and rebuild, you have to do it differently. Not because it's the ethical thing, though it is. Because it's the only way it will work. The people you cut, the culture you dissolved, those things weren't inefficiencies. They were the company. You need to understand that before you sign anything." Sophia looked at the check. She looked at the man across from her. She said, "And if I can't?" He said, "Then don't take the check and start something entirely new, from scratch, with what you've learned." He stood up, buttoned his coat, and looked at her with an expression that was almost not quite, but almost warm. "The offer is open until morning," he said. "Get some sleep. Think about who you want to be when you wake up, not what you want to achieve, who you want to be." He walked to the door. He paused, the same way he had paused 3 years ago, in the same building, on a rainy Tuesday, but this time he turned around. He said, "For what it's worth, the version of you that believed this company could change something, she was worth fighting for." He left. Sophia sat alone in the empty office with a blank check on her desk and the rain soft against the windows. And for the first time in 3 years, she did not try to calculate her way out of anything. She simply sat with what was true. She did not sleep that night, but she did not use the hours trying to construct a strategy or a plan or a defense. Instead, she sat with the photograph from the company's early days. She looked at the faces of the people in it. She tried to remember their names, and was surprised to find that she could all of them, every single one, even the ones who had left in the first year, even the ones whose departures she had recorded as operational adjustments rather than losses. Marcus, who had built the first product prototype in a rented basement and stayed late every night for 6 months without ever being asked. Diane, who had handled client relations with a warmth and precision that no software could replicate, and who had cried quietly in the hallway outside the conference room after the November restructuring, and then walked out with her head high. James, who had covered 3 roles simultaneously during a particularly brutal quarter, and asked for nothing in return except to be trusted. She had trusted them, once. She had simply stopped, at some point, when trust began to feel like vulnerability, and vulnerability felt like weakness, and weakness felt like the thing that would undo everything she had built. What she understood now at 3 in the morning, in a building the bank would come for in 6 hours, was that the undoing had happened anyway. And the walls she had built to prevent it were, themselves, the instrument of its arrival. She thought about something her mother had said to her once, when she was 16 and had won a debate competition at school, and come home more proud of having beaten her opponent than of the argument she had made. Her mother had said, You can be right and still be wrong if what you're right about costs you the only things that matter. Sophia had not understood it then. She understood it now, in the full, expensive, irreversible way that some lessons can only be learned after they've already been paid for. She signed the check at 4:30 in the morning. Not for the full amount she technically needed, for what she actually needed, which was less because she had spent the night calculating not the maximum she could take, but the minimum that would allow her to do this with integrity. She called her attorney at 7. She called the bank at 8:15 and negotiated a 48-hour extension. She called Daniel at 8:50 and told him the amount she had written on the check. He said, "Okay," and nothing more, which she found she preferred to whatever else he might have said. Then she made the other calls, the ones she had been putting off for 3 years because they required her to say things she had been unwilling to say. She called Marcus. She called Diane. She called James. She said, each time, "I owe you an apology that is long overdue. And I owe you an explanation. And I would like, if you're willing, to ask for a conversation." She did not ask them to come back. She was not ready to ask for that yet. She simply asked to be heard, and then to listen. The months that followed were not a montage. They were harder than that, slower, less cinematic. Full of the kind of setbacks that don't resolve neatly into growth but simply have to be endured. Sophia sold the penthouse in early January. The equity covered approximately half the outstanding payroll obligations she had never fully settled from the final months of the company's collapse. She moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on the west side of the city, the kind of place where the heating system was unreliable and the elevator had been out of service 3 times in the first month. She found, to her considerable surprise, that she did not miss the penthouse. What she missed, she was learning, were things that money had not purchased and neglect had eroded. The sense of building something with other people, the particular pleasure of a problem solved by minds working in concert, the feeling of being trusted and of trusting in return. She cooked her own meals for the first time in years. She took the subway because she had sold the car as part of the asset liquidation. She sat in the subway car in the mornings, surrounded by people on their way to their own work and their own lives. And instead of looking at her phone or reviewing documents, she looked at their faces, just looked. The way she had forgotten how to do, trying to remember that the world was full of people who were carrying things she would never see or know. Daniel met with her twice a week in the early months, not as an investor, not as a board member, but as something she didn't quite have a word for. Advisor was too formal, friend was too presumptuous, at least at first. He did not tell her what to do. He asked questions, the kind of questions that had no right answers, but that, in the asking, revealed the shape of what she was trying to figure out. Why do you want to rebuild this particular company, rather than starting something new? What do you think a client actually needs from you that they couldn't get somewhere else? What does success look like to you in 5 years? Not in numbers, but in terms of what a day at work feels like. She found these questions harder than any financial modeling she had ever done. She was not accustomed to thinking in those terms. She had always moved from problem to solution, from question to answer, from obstacle to strategy, with the shortest possible distance between each point. The questions Daniel asked did not have shortest distances. They had only the honest path, which was usually also the longer one. He brought his daughter to one of their meetings, a girl named Claire, who was 10 years old and severely unimpressed by the business world, and who spent the entire meeting doing homework at the other end of the table and occasionally asking her father if she could have more of whatever was in the vending machine down the hall. Sophia watched Daniel explain compound interest to Claire using the vending machine pricing structure, and felt something shift in her chest that she didn't analyze too closely. It had to do, she thought, with watching someone be fully present with another person with no agenda, no leverage, no strategic consideration simply because the other person was there and mattered. She had not seen that in a long time. She was not entirely sure she had ever done it herself. The moment that the press would later call Sophia's comeback, the moment that her eventual profile in the business press would describe as her defining act of courage was, in her experience, mostly terrifying. The opportunity came in the form of a major technology firm looking to partner with a boutique operations consultancy for a long-term infrastructure project. The contract was large enough to be genuinely transformative. 2 other firms were competing for it. 3 days before the final presentations, one of the competing firms, through channels that were technically legal and comprehensively ruthless, released information to the prospective client, suggesting that Carter Dynamics was still financially unstable, that the recent restructuring was cosmetic, that the new management culture was a performance rather than a reality. The information was not false, exactly. It was selectively true, assembled from real facts arranged to produce a damaging impression. Sophia received the news late on a Wednesday night. She sat at her kitchen table in the West Side apartment, with her laptop open, and read the summary her communications director had forwarded her. She could see, immediately, how to respond. She had been in this position before, or positions structurally similar, where the adversary had moved first, and the only effective counter was to move harder, faster, and without scruple. She had a contact at the competing firm who owed her a favor. She had information that would, if released, compromise the opposing bid in ways that the prospective client would find difficult to overlook. It would be proportional. It would be effective. It would be, in the language of the world she had spent 15 years navigating, simply how the game was played. She sat with it for a long time. Then she closed the laptop and went to bed. In the morning, she prepared the presentation she had originally planned. She did not adjust it to address the competitor's accusations. She did not deploy the countermeasures she had considered. When she stood in front of the prospective client's executive team 3 days later, in a conference room that reminded her, painfully, of rooms she had sat in 100 times before, she said what was true. She said that Carter Dynamics had failed, comprehensively, for reasons that began with her own choices and her own blind spots. She did not dress this up. She did not frame it as a learning experience or a pivot, or a strategic realignment, the vocabulary of failure that the business world had developed to describe failure without naming it. She used the plain word, failure. She said that she had believed for most of her career that the measure of a company was its numbers, and that the people who produced those numbers were, at some level, interchangeable, that talent was a resource to be managed, loyalty, a sentiment that didn't survive contact with balance sheets, and culture, a story told to prospective hires that bore limited relationship to operational reality. She said she had been wrong, not theoretically wrong, not wrong in the way of a miscalculation that can be corrected on the next iteration, but wrong in the foundational sense, wrong about what companies are, wrong about what leadership is, wrong about what the whole enterprise of building something together with other people actually means. She said that the company had been rebuilt, not on the pretense that those failures hadn't happened, but on the specific lessons they had produced. She said that the culture the competitor had characterized as cosmetic was, in fact, the most real thing she had built in 15 years, because it was the first culture she had built by listening to the people who had to live inside it, rather than imposing a structure, and then wondering why it kept breaking. She finished. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the client's chief operating officer, a man named Gerald Whitmore, who had the kind of face that gave away very little, looked at her across the table and said, "We chose you 3 weeks ago, Miss Carter, before any of this, because someone who used to work for you told us something about you that we wanted to verify for ourselves." He paused. He said that if you ever managed to become the leader you had the capacity to be, there would be no one better to work with. We've spent the last 3 weeks deciding whether he was right. He looked at her steadily. He was. She found out later, in the car on the way back, that the person who had said those things was Daniel Reed. She sat in the back seat in the midday traffic and looked out the window at the city moving past, and did not try to say anything or feel anything in particular. She simply let it land. The company meeting she held 4 months after the contract was signed was, by the standards of business meetings, a strange one. It was held on a Saturday morning, and the agenda sent out 2 days in advance had only one item: a conversation. Not a strategy session, not a performance review, not a communications briefing. A conversation. Sophia stood at the front of the room, a room full of people, not all of whom had been there from the beginning, but many of whom had, and some of whom had come back after leaving, and all of whom had, at some point, made a choice to be there, and she said things she had never said publicly before. She said that she had spent most of her career believing that leadership meant having the right answers faster than anyone else in the room. She said that what she now understood slowly, expensively, in the manner of a lesson that arrives only after everything else has failed, was that leadership was something different. It was the capacity to make people feel that their presence in the room was the thing that made the room worth being in. It was the ability to create conditions in which people could do the best work of their lives, not because they feared the consequences of failing, but because they believed in what they were building and believed they were trusted to build it. She said, "I spent years thinking that the job of a leader was to win. What I know now is that the job of a leader is to make people want to win alongside you." No one in the room made a sound. Then someone near the back started clapping. And then someone else. And then the room. After the meeting, she found Daniel in the corridor outside. He was leaning against the wall with his coat over his arm, watching her with an expression she had come to recognize, that particular combination of patience and warmth that she had once misread as absence of ambition and now understood to be something considerably rarer. She had the check in her jacket pocket. She had been carrying it for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. She handed it to him. He looked at it, the original blank check he had placed on her desk that Tuesday night, now voided. With her signature across the face and a date and a note in her handwriting in the memo field. He read the note. He looked up. She said, "You know what that says?" He said, "I do." She said, "What you gave me that night was never money. I'd like you to have it back. Because I don't need it. What I needed is the thing I can't give back, because I've already used it." He folded the check and put it in his pocket. He said, "Keep building." She said, "I will." They stood for a moment in the corridor, the sounds of the company filling the air around them, voices, movement, the ordinary, irreplaceable noise of people doing their work, and neither of them said anything more, because nothing more needed to be said. A year later, Carter Dynamics bore very little resemblance to the company it had once been, and everything it had once hoped to be. The financial recovery was real, documented, and steady. 2 new product lines had launched. The staff roster had grown by 31%, and the voluntary turnover rate, the number the industry used to measure whether people actually wanted to stay, had dropped to one of the lowest figures in the sector. 3 of the people Sophia had called in those early morning hours after her conversation with Daniel had returned. Marcus, now leading product development. Diane, now heading client relations with a team she had helped to build. James, now managing operations with a calm and generosity that was entirely characteristic. The press coverage, when it came, was different from what it had been before, not because Sophia managed it differently, though she did, but because the story it was covering was different. The headline that circulated most was one that Sophia had not planned or anticipated, from a writer who had covered the company's collapse and had now come back to cover what had come after it. The headline said, "What a failed CEO learned when the person she fired came back to help her." On the morning of the company's anniversary, the anniversary of the day she had signed the check, the day she had made the calls, the day she had decided, Sophia arrived at the office before anyone else and stood at the window of her new office, which was smaller than the old one, and looked out at the city in the early light. The sky was the particular gray-blue of early morning in autumn, and the streets below were quiet in the way that streets are only quiet in that narrow window before the city fully wakes, when the day has not yet committed itself to being ordinary. On the wall behind her was the framed photograph from the early days. On the wall beside the door was a single line of text, mounted in simple letters, that had been there since the day the new office opened. It read, "People build companies, not the other way around." She had put it there herself. On a Saturday morning before the office officially opened, standing on a chair with a level and a pencil mark while Claire supervised from the doorway and told her it was slightly crooked, which it was, by perhaps 2 degrees, and she had left it that way on purpose, because she liked the reminder that some things did not need to be perfect to be exactly right. She heard the elevator open in the hall, and the sound of familiar footsteps. And then Daniel appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and Claire behind him, carrying a backpack and looking as thoroughly unimpressed with the business world as she always did. Daniel handed Sophia a cup. He looked around the office, the photograph, the wall text, the clear desk with its single notebook and its single pen, which was how she worked now, one thing at a time, with full attention. He said, "How does it feel?" She thought about it. She said, "Like a beginning." He nodded, as though this was the correct answer, which perhaps it was. Claire found a chair in the corner and opened her homework. The city outside was clear and cold in the early light, and below them, the streets were already filling with people on their way to whatever they were building. Sophia Carter stood at the window with a cup of coffee and looked at it all the city. The morning, the ordinary miracle of people choosing to show up, and she thought about what it had cost to learn the one thing that mattered. And she thought that, perhaps, in the end, nothing worth keeping had ever arrived any other way. She had once stood on a rooftop in the rain and looked at the same city as though it were something happening to her. Now she looked at it as something she was part of. The difference was everything.